here you have the grave of the Maharal. By the way, he was buried right next to his life peril. Now, I didn't point out, but right at the beginning I mentioned that we know he passed away in 1609. The question is, was he born in 1612, 1616, or 1627? Either way, he was at least 81. He was between 81 and 98 when he passed away, somewhere in that range. But he lived, for those days, there was a long life. For those days, there were 81 to 90 is considered a long life. And that's where he lived. He was buried next to his partner, Peril, in the cemetery. Okay, now, let's have a look at the teachings and approach and influence of the Maharal. Now, this is really, really fundamental and defines all the Maharal's views, teachings, and works. Look at the first one. The wisdom of the great sages of the Mishnah and Gemara is infinitely greater than that of the nations of the world. All the wise of the nations of the world are like the peel of an onion in comparison to the wise sages of Israel. Now, this is, if someone asks me, what is one of the central themes that run through the teaching of the Maharal, is the Maharal did not accept the view that the teachings of the sages of Israel could be taken superficially at surface value. He did not take that view. In fact, we'll discuss it in a moment, there are many teachings of the sages that if you take them at surface view, they are weird. And I'll give you one, for example. In this context, I'll give you one that just comes to my mind because he discussed it in the book Barak. Chazal say that the Torah says that Adam gave names to the animals, right? So there's a midrash that says, that Adam, Baal kol hachayot v'avamot, he had relations with all the animals to know what they were about, and then he named them. Now that is a teaching which is bizarre. There are many teachings like this. The sages, the Maharal's view was that you could never take, and he explains what it means in his book Barak, but the Maharal has two, his main premise is this: if the sages of the Talmud and the Mishnah said something, it is of the greatest, infinite wisdom, and whatever wisdom the nations of the world will come up with is keklipat hashum, that's how he expresses it, is like the peel of an onion. This means it's insignificant. The peel of an onion is very brittle. It's insignificant compared to the wisdom of Chazal. That is, and that has many ramifications. So first of all, the second one. The words of the sages cannot and should not, and should not be taken superficially or lightly. The sages never express the obvious, and all their teachings are novel and profound. The Maharal, when he takes any teaching of the sages, if you or I could have figured it out on our own, he says that's not what the sage meant. Because he believes that everything that every sage wrote had something in it that was new or novel, or else, alternatively, the sage would never accept. The third thing, our sages teach us fundamental principles. Now, this is very, very important. Understanding these fundamental principles provides a framework of understanding human behavior and the commandments of the Torah. So the Maharal, this is very, very important. The Maharal, and the beauty of the Maharal, is that he shows that the whole Torah, and I'm going to give you an example at the end, but he shows how the whole Torah, it's not just a law here, this law, that law, this law, that law. It's not like that. It's a system. And he shows how the system, based on certain principles, it all links together. Torah Hashem Tamimah. The Torah Hashem is complete and it is one unit. That's the methodology of the Maharal. Now, this is, I mentioned this point earlier, that he was a champion of the Rambam's approach to earning a livelihood and not using Torah study and teaching as a means of earning a livelihood. Now, this point 5, which I started mentioning earlier, but it's a very important point, the Maharal felt that the sages, you see it says in Pirkei Avot in the Ethics of the Fathers, Ben Chamesh LeMikra. At 5 years old you should teach a child Chumash. When do you teach a child Chumash? 5 years old. 10 years old, what do you teach him? Mishnah. 15-year-old, what do you teach him? Gemara. Now today, it doesn't work that way, in most places. Today, they take a kid, he's 6, 7, they're already starting 8, they're starting learning Gemara. Now Gemara is very difficult. The Maharal was very against that because he felt that we push children, and it's actually very interesting, that he felt that it is not positive to push children beyond their natural cognitive development. Very interesting. I know in schools today, people tell me that 10 years ago, what you learned in, that they're bringing things, they're raising the standard all the time kind of thing. And that's not necessarily, by the way, a positive thing. Because a child's mind, as you grow older, naturally as the brain develops, as your cognitive understanding and your maturity develop, you're ready for certain things. And if you force those things too early, it's very problematic. There are schools and a system of schools, I think they call them Zilberstein in Israel today, and they're all over the world, where they actually do the system. They won't teach the kids Chumash until they're 10. They won't teach them Gemara until they're 15. And there is a tremendous logic in that. And he made sure that in his area of, call it reign, that this was instituted. So that was a very important teaching of the Maharal. Now, his general approach, he clothes deep Kabbalistic ideas in a rational philosophical framework. The Maharal was, no doubt, he mentions in certain places, but the Maharal was a Kabbalist. He was a Mekubal, he was a Talmudic scholar, but he was a Kabbalist. He knew the Kabbalistic teachings inside out and back to front. And he brings down those principles in a very understandable, natural, philosophical framework to understand the mitzvot of the Torah. Now, this is a very important point here. As a result of the above, the Maharal is revealed accepted both by Hasidic and non-Hasidic thinkers alike. Very interesting. I went once for a Shabbat in a yeshiva called Beit El. Beit El yeshiva, there's an area called Beit El in Israel, and they're having a Shabbat there. So I went once there for Shabbat. So I asked one of the, my cousin of mine took me there, had a friend learning there. I asked them what their Seder HaLimud is, what do they learn? So one of the things they used to learn was Maharal. But what did they used to call that time when they learned Maharal? The Emunah Seder. The Seder of having faith in Hashem. Belief. Why? Because when you learn the Maharal and you understand the depth of the sages and of the Torah, that gives a person tremendous faith. So actually I believe that they're terming that Seder Emunah. But as I say, the Vilna Gaon was influenced by the Maharal, and so was, by the way, it's well known in Chabad circles that the book Tanya, he writes in the beginning there where he got all these things from, and one of the things he writes there is Sfarim. That Sfarim is the Sifrei Maharal. They have a tradition that Sfarim is the books of the Maharal. So the Maharal was influenced everyone afterwards. That's why I say that he is really universally accepted. Now, what were his works? There are many. And I have learnt, not all of them through and through, but I've learnt many of them, much of them. And they are the most fantastic works. First one, Gur Aryeh, is a commentary on Rashi on the Torah. Rashi comments on the Torah, so you have to have a commentary on Rashi. Right? To explain Rashi. By the way, there's hundreds of commentaries on Rashi. Okay? Now, Derech HaChaim, and there's commentaries on those commentaries as well. Okay, Derech HaChaim is a commentary on Pirkei Avot. It's a wonderful commentary we've mentioned it a number of times on Shabbat afternoon. Gvurot Hashem speaks about Pesach and the Exodus from Egypt. Netzach Yisrael speaks about redemption. Moshiach, Tiferet Yisrael speaks about Torah. Nativot Olam speaks about character traits and central themes in Judaism. Then he's got Chidush Agadot. Now what is this? There's certain sections of the Talmud which are halachic. There's certain sections which are stories. And some of them, by the way, are not meant to be taken literally, and they sound bizarre. The Maharal explains what the sages meant in those sections, and to the most unbelievable degree. He wrote a book called Barak. Barak, remember I mentioned the teaching of the sages earlier with Adam and the animals that were strange. He spends a whole book explaining all the teachings of the sages that sound bizarre. That's his book. To defend, in defense of the teachings of the sages, that people look at them and they say, come on, you can't accept this primitive stuff. The Maharal answers up all those teachings. It's called Barak, a fascinating work. He's got a book on Hanukkah, a book on Purim, and he's got on the Talmud, etc., and many other books. Now, what I want to do today, in the few minutes that we have remaining, is I want to take one teaching of the Maharal Because, in truth, very little is recorded of his personal life. I didn't mention he had 7 children, 6 daughters, 1 son. He lost his son. His son became a rabbi, I think, of Copenhagen. Passed away in the early 17th century. His son passed away in his lifetime. So, but we don't know all that much about his personal life. But I want to show you a teaching of the sages. And even if you've been asleep up till now, it is worth waking up for the next few minutes. Okay? Now, this, it's not so clear. This is a midrash. Okay? We're quoting